Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new editions of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. We're grateful to our partners this evening, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, and the Hemingway Society. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. To call Ernest Hemingway a larger-than-life figure in American letters is a bit of an understatement. Intrepid journalist, golden boy of avant-garde Paris in the 20s, a writer who revolutionized American prose, a very rare achievement, big game hunter, bullfighting aficionado, war correspondent, a celebrity whose legend was fed by his own self-mythologizing, and then a shocking, tragic end. It's not surprising that 100 years on, his colossal, complex, and controversial legacy remains inescapably compelling to readers, critics, biographers, and filmmakers. How does Hemingway speak to us today? Is it still possible to read him in fresh and unexpected ways? Joining us tonight to explore these and other questions are filmmakers Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein and Hemingway scholar Robert Trogdon. Tonight's event marks publication of this volume, Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises and Other Writings, 1918 to 1926, volume 334 in the Library of America series, which presents new corrected texts of Hemingway's breakthrough works from his Paris years. It is edited by Robert Trogdon, who joins us shortly. First, we welcome two acclaimed filmmakers. Lynn Novick and I have been friends for close to 30 years, during which I've watched her become one of America's most distinguished documentary filmmakers. After producing Ken Burns's Baseball, she went on to co-direct Jazz, the War, Prohibition, the Vietnam War, and the forthcoming Hemingway, a three-part, 6-hour series that premieres in April 2021. With her is her longtime collaborator on all these films, acclaimed producer Sarah Botstein. Lynn and Sarah have brought an advanced clip to show, which we'll screen now. A reminder that our guests tonight invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. Now, here's a clip from Hemingway, directed by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, and produced by Sarah Botstein. Bravo. Sarah's here too. Great. Thank you for sharing that with us. Welcome, Lynn and Sarah. I guess, the first and obvious question is, why did you want to make this film? What drew you to the story?
I think we'll both try to answer that. Just to say, first of all, thank you for having us here tonight. And thank you to Library of America, which is such an extraordinary cultural institution. We're so grateful for the work you do and for keeping American letters alive and vibrant and relevant. So it's really an honor to be here tonight. So thank you. I personally will say that I fell in love with Hemingway when I was in high school and read just the words on the page just seemed so luminous and full of life and so evocative and sort of a portal into worlds that I did not know about and felt as fresh and modern, and the characters sort of so relatable and yet larger than life. So as a teenager, I fell in love with Hemingway. Then I saw his picture as a young man. So then I really fell in love with Hemingway, just this gorgeous human being. But I put that aside. And then about 25 years ago, I went to Key West on a vacation and went to the Hemingway home there and went into his studio. And I truly had a lightning bolt moment, which I've rarely had in my life, of just being in this space, being told that he wrote A Farewell to Arms in this room or part of it, and other great works, and just, feeling, wow, there's a spirit here. There's some kind of force. There's some kind of clarity of being in the space that he had inhabited with his stuff, thinking he would be a great subject for a film. And to be honest, I didn't know that much about him. So I bought a biography in the gift shop. I read the biography and came back and talked to Ken and Jeff Ward, our writer, about one day we should do Hemingway. And it took us a long time to get there, and here we finally are.
I have a wildly different answer. Obviously, my job is to produce films with Ken and Lynn, and we were doing Hemingway. But for me, I read very little Hemingway in high school and college, and he was sort of passed down to me as somebody who was difficult, not so likable, complicated, and the challenge to make a film that focused on one person's life, because the films I've worked on with Ken and Lynn are these big, broad, sweeping subjects, was enormously interesting to just dive in and try to actually get to know somebody and to square someone's life with their talent and their art and all of the questions that arise from the examination of a great artist, great, interesting human being. So for me, it was a totally different kind of film to make and extremely interesting for that reason. And I'm a reader, and to read all of his works as an adult while getting to know him was really truly fun thing to do.
So you both, after not a long familiarity with Hemingway's work, suddenly plunged into it and had to learn everything about him. And so, I mean, the question is, so what did you discover about him and his work? I mean, you say that, you discovered this relatable person. I mean, what was it that you connected with most, would you say?
It's very hard to describe what one of the people we interviewed just talks about, his magic on the printed page, the vividness and the use of language and the way he crafts both characters and scenes and pares things down to their essentials, but brings the world alive that he's conjuring. I can't explain how he does it. I know that when he's imitated, it doesn't go well. I think one of the things we discovered, and it's really quite a long list, is just an intimacy with him through his words, both the published fiction, the letters, and hearing the actors that you heard already, Jeff Daniels reading Hemingway, bring this to life, sort of made us feel intimately connected to him and who he was. So that's one thing. And seeing the craft, the way he worked and reworked and worked again on what he was doing, seeing the manuscripts, you see that a little bit in the page you saw from up in Michigan, but over and over again, you see how much it took to end up with what we see in the printed page. Seems so easy and effortless, but we see the effort that went into it.
Sarah, did you want to comment? Or?
Yeah, I think I would say a lot of the same things that Lynn said, but also just to say that an exploration of Hemingway is really an exploration of a deeply flawed, complicated human being. And we are all complicated human beings, good and bad, and trying to actually get to know him as a person, as a father, as a husband, as a friend, as a disloyal, complicated celebrity. And also, to Lynn's point, just how deeply disciplined he was as a writer, even in those hugely complicated moments of his celebrity. And, you cannot like certain aspects of him as a person living in the world, and then you fall in love with him as a writer. And the tension in those two things is, I think we both felt the whole time making the film, as did Ken and Jeff.
And I will just also say, the short stories, which I know many are the early work collected in your volume, were a true revelation. The novels get a lot of the attention, and perhaps rightly so, but the genius of Hemingway, a lot of it is in those short stories. So we, reading all of them and picking which ones we could actually highlight was really a true revelation, and we hope for a lot of our viewers.
Did a favorite emerge from that? Or?
A favorite is so hard. Some of our favorites are not in the film. We could have made a whole film just about In Our Time, frankly, because I think every single work in there is a gem. And the vignettes that separate the chapters of the stories are also brilliant and deep. So it's going to sound strange. One of my favorites is Soldier's Home, which is not in the film, but the way he portrays someone's inner turmoil so beautifully it's very elusive and it's very powerful.
Yeah, and the story appears in Our Time, it's in the 1925 edition, which is in Oliver America volume. it's funny you say, it's hard to know how he does what he does. And I remember that Philip Roth always used to refer, whenever his name come up, he would say, Hemingway's a magician, he would say. There's a couple of things you mentioned I wanted to kind of follow up on. You talked about literary celebrity, and Hemingway is one of the first literary artists who's working in that complicated place where literary art and career meets literary celebrity. And I wonder, obviously it's part of the story you need to tell. And I wonder what your sense of how that plays out in his life is. And I mean, how do you see it? I mean, some people understand it as a tragic arc. Some people see it differently. I mean, what's your take on how, the Hemingway, the man, Hemingway, the literary artist, and Hemingway, the celebrity, those three strands work out in the story that you have to tell?
Well, that's the whole movie right there.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
it's different in each episode.
Yeah.
It's different at each station in his life, obviously. It's a great question. It's the central thesis of the film, is how do you wrestle with all three aspects of the layers of Hemingway that I do think one thing that was interesting to me that I didn't know going into making the film is that he, is one of the most photographed people in the 20th century. He was everywhere, did everything, lived all over the world, was incredibly charismatic. The camera loved him. And there are thousands of photographs of him, but there's very little moving footage of him and virtually no footage of him talking, very little. Because of when he lived, but also he was uncomfortable in front of the moving camera. And that's really interesting for a celebrity, right? He loved to kind of control a still image, but you can't do as much when a live movie camera is rolling. So the footage is priceless for that reason, as you try to really frame by frame understand who he is, moving around, talking, interacting with people, and wrestling, I think, internally with the performative nature of the celebrity. Because I think he was also a very private person in a funny way.
Mm-hmm. So we're 100 years basically from, Hemingway, more or less from Hemingway's arrival in Paris and the beginning of this story, really. And so I guess I'm curious, I mean, are there ways that Hemingway has been understood or misunderstood in your view that telling his story now in 2020 allows us to see? I mean, in other words, do you feel that your film corrects or adjusts in certain ways the way Hemingway has been understood up till now?
We hope so. I think we hope so very much. I mean, we did set out to make a 4-hour film, and the story was so rich it ended up being 6 hours, and partly because of that question, that we wanted to acknowledge what the myths were and the misconceptions, but also go way deep, as Sarah was saying, through them and into something that felt authentic and true. And, there's no getting around that who we are now affects how we see who he was then and what aspects of the work resonate and don't. But I think Edna kind of touches on it in her commentary. There are people who think he hated women, and, she's sort of implying wouldn't read Hemingway for that reason, and that he didn't understand women. And that's a great conversation for us to be having. We feel that the film gives, hopefully, people permission to discover Hemingway on their own. Bring who you are to the work and read it yourself and see what you think, and not let the myth get in the way of the work itself. But there's a lot there to unpack. Yeah.
Let's just push on that a little bit, because that is the subject of the clip. The story is quite shocking. It's a story of it depends how you want to talk about it, a date rape, we might say now, it's something like that. And I guess what I'm curious, and it was shocking at the time. I mean, it was quite shocking at the time, and was supposed to be included in our time, and then in the end was not, because it was felt that it was too shocking to publish. And I guess I'm curious, a lot of the stories in our time are about very difficult things. And in that sense, the story isn't really apart from I mean, there are other stories that involve violence by the strong against the weak, that involve the failure of connection in relationship, you know what I mean, in relationships. So I guess what I'm wondering is, I mean, how do you see that story, you know, resonating with others, with what else Hemingway is writing at the time, and where do you come out on this question of whether it reflects, I mean, a kind of dark view of women on Hemingway's part, or in what way it kind of fits into the kind of terrible honesty, I guess I would say, that he's aiming for in these stories. That a kind of honest, I'm sorry, this is a long question, I know, but I mean, an honesty that includes very violent things. And in fact, maybe you could mention what the opening story in Our Time is, and how that launches you into the world that he depicts there.
Indian camp, are we talking
Yes.
about? Yeah. Yeah, and we do have a long section in the film about Indian camp, which is the story of a young avatar of Hemingway, one could say, a child named Nick Adams, whose father is a doctor like Hemingway's father was, and they're in Michigan, a place where they also spent time. So one of the, you know, parlor games of Hemingway biography is to kind of match up things that happened in his work to things that happened in his life, and we don't do that. But you see that he conjures milieu and worlds that he was familiar with from his own life and then turns them into art. And in that story, for people here who probably everyone here may know, but the father's a doctor and they go across the lake at night. The father's going to deliver a baby, and it's a Native American woman who's in serious distress, and he has to perform a cesarean without anesthesia. And while this is happening, this young boy is listening to her scream. It's very gory and violent and kind of gothic almost in nature, and shocking, truly shocking. It has a real twist at the end as well, which I will not spoil for those who don't know it. So I do imagine, you know, Hemingway's parents opening that book and reading that story and just, I mean, it is shocking. And he was aiming to shock. He was trying to get, you know, go the places where people hadn't gone before in literature, in American literature. And with up in Michigan, they obviously went a little too far for what people could take. But, you know, he was pushing the envelope, as we would say, to get at, the, as you said, the honesty and darkness and pain and cruelty. And, you know, these are often not happy stories, but that seems to be what he was fascinated with. And now I can't remember the rest of the question.
Well, I think just to piggyback on what Lynn was saying, I think one of the interviewees says in the film that Hemingway is like a camera coming in ECU in this, he doesn't give you all the context of where you are. You're in a moment of somebody's life, and it's complicated, deeply raw moment. I mean, he's so good at that, right? And he's doing it with, another interviewee says, some apparent simplicity of language, but it's so highly sophisticated. And you have to bring so much to this intimate moment that is dark, complicated, scary, very, very real, very, very human. And so he's wrestling with the human condition all the time in these very specific, hard moments. And that's, you know, great writing. And different, new.
I think it's a good place to pause. Sarah and Lynn will be back shortly, but right now we're going to invite Robert Trogdon for a conversation about the book. See you shortly. We now welcome Robert Trogdon, editor of the Library of America Hemingway edition. He's professor of English at Kent State University and served as editor, for the Cambridge edition of the Letters of Ernest Hemingway. Welcome, Robert.
Glad to be here.
So the volume that you've edited covers the period 1918 to 1926. And I wonder if you could just talk about the significance of that period first. Both, I mean, the significance of that period for Hemingway and the significance of that period for American literature, maybe more broadly.
For Hemingway, excuse me, coming back from World War I, he set out immediately in 1919 to become a fiction writer. He had been for 2 years a journalist in Kansas City. Check my volume here just a bit, sorry. And when he returned, he started writing, but he was writing these things for adventure magazines, roughly equivalent to true romance. They're very cliched and hackneyed. It was only after he returned to Europe in 1921 and came under the tutelage of Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound that he really became the modern writer that we know. He was able to take his experiences in Michigan and Kansas City and Chicago and in Italy during the war and create something new in that, stripping out all of the cliches. A lot of this is the influence of Ezra Pound for a type of imagism, and prose is the best way I can explain it. And Gertrude Stein with the simplicity of language, but the use of repetition. And Europe and Paris gave him a chance to get his work into print before he could do that in America at the time. So really from 1922 to 1924, when most of the stories that are in our time are written, most in 1924, he is able to create something new in the short story, get exposure to it, and build interest in the United States. It's those first two volumes, the 3 Stories and 10 Poems, and the In Our Time, which are the little vignettes that occur between the stories in the In Our Time, published in 1925, that get the attention. And so you get people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who sees those volumes and is able to write back to his publisher that this is someone to watch. And people like Harold Loeb, who is the model for Robert Cohn in The Sun Also Rises, introduced him to Horace Liveright, who became his first American publisher. So Hemingway is working in a very new type of literature. It's moving beyond the realism and naturalism that you have before the war, but it's still accessible. He said in one of his first letters to his publisher that my work will be praised by highbrows and can be read by lowbrows. There's nothing in it that someone without a high school education cannot understand. So that's the thing. He is seemingly simple, but once you get into the works, there's so much complexity in there.
And so his first stories are published, in 22 in there, right?
And 23.
1923. And by 24, 25, 26, he's publishing masterpieces. He's publishing stories like Big Two-Hearted River, like Soldier's Home, like Indian Camp, and Sun Also Rises. How do you account for the apparent speed and lack of apprenticeship? I mean, if you compare, Faulkner and Steinbeck, who had, rather longer apprenticeships to get to, hitting their stride, finding their subject and their style, Hemingway almost seems to be there within months of turning from poetry to prose. What's your take on that?
Well, there is the apprenticeship in journalism. There is the experience in Kansas City in 1917 and 1918, but more important, the work for the Toronto Star in Canada, which hired him as basically a glorified European freelancer. So he was traveling in Europe in 1921 to 1923, filing stories for the Toronto Star. And so he's writing all the time. He's writing a great deal that never sees print. The famous story is that most of his early work was lost in December of 1922 when the valets that Hadley his first wife, Hadley Hemingway, was going to join him in Switzerland, and she packed up all of his manuscripts so he could work on them over the vacation. And the suitcase disappeared, whether it was stolen, misled, but that there was a novel that he was working on. There were several short stories. The only thing that really got saved from that was Up in Michigan, My Old Man, and Out of Season, because they were out in circulation. He would have them send them out to magazines. So a lot of the early evidence for this apprenticeship is not there, but he's working just as much in 1919, 1920, 1921. It's just that when he does make the leap to what he writes in 1924, it seems like a quantum leap. It seems like he's just gone like light years beyond where he was.
Yeah, you mentioned the Toronto Star reporting. You've chosen some of those for the book. One of the stories that he covered was the Greco-Turkish War, which makes an appearance in his early fiction and in our time. Anything you have a comment about that? Like what the impact of that was on him and why, it shows up in both versions of In Our Time?
It's an extension of the violence that is ushered in by the First World War. The title In Our Time is meant to be ironic because it comes from the Book of Common Prayer and is "Give us peace in our time, O Lord." And of course, part of the thing about the collection, both the vignettes and story collection, is that there is very little peace that's expressed in the novel. And it's the 1920s are a very violent time, especially in Europe, where you have the turmoil in Germany. You have the Greco-Turkish War, which stays with Hemingway for a long time, even into the 1930s. He's still writing about that in Snows of Kilimanjaro. He is able in his dispatches to almost have first drafts of the things on the Quay at Smyrna, which eventually was published in 1930. The vignette, chapter 2, about the minarets struck up, and there's a couple of pieces where he writes about the refugee crisis. And what is amazing to me is that the metaphor of herding, where the cavalry are essentially herding the refugees, is in those early dispatches and then in the fiction. So he's working through it over and over.
So let's move on to Sun Also Rises. One of the remarkable things that you've done for this Library of America volume is established a new text for The Sun Also Rises, which people may be surprised at since the book's been around for a long time. But modernist writers, as Noah Polk, who established Library of America's Faulkner texts, once wrote, did with their medium what modernist painters did with theirs, which is to say, painters, toyed with techniques and used them expressively, paint and things like that. The writers did the same thing. They used punctuation and capitalization and other aspects of their craft expressively for the first time. And that's something that you've uncovered in doing this textual work. So if you could briefly describe what you've done and how you think it affects how we read Sun Also Rises.
The big change is that the final line of Sun Also Rises in the Library of America edition is, "Isn't it pretty to think so?" Period. Not a question mark. And for me, this is a pattern that I saw fairly regularly when looking at the manuscripts and the typescripts of the works, and Hemingway not using a question mark for rhetorical questions, instead leaving it just a full stop. So there's several instances in Sun Also Rises. Someone remarks about Brett Ashley looking good, and Jake says, is being a good-looking woman, and Jake responding, "Isn't she?" Full stop instead of a period. But of course, that doesn't get the attention that the ending does. And as an editor, I'm interested in trying to get as close to what Hemingway would have wanted in an ideal world. And with the manuscript and the typescript both lacking the question mark, and knowing that Hemingway punctuated rhetorically rather than logically, that he had different sets of rules. And I actually went back and looked at guides to punctuation and grammar in the 1920s. And it was not a set rule. And in some instances, rhetorical questions were, you were told to use a period and not a question mark. But it just makes the ending just so more depressing, and Jake's situation. So there's no hope that he and Brett are going to get out of the situation that they are in. And it's just this note of finality that he has here at the conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah. And the flatness of it, I have to say, it changed it a lot for me. Because with the question mark, you wonder, well, is it an aggressive remark toward Brett? Like, is he attacking her, or is it a self-pitying? But when you see it without the question mark, you realize what it is it's kind of like the epitaph for the lost generation and
Right.
their loss of illusion. And anyway, I think it's quite brilliant. And I think maybe with that, we'll invite Lynn and Sarah back in, and the three of you maybe can comment on some broader questions, and then some questions from the audience as well. Welcome back.
Just want to say, I cannot wait to read the new edition of Sun Also Rises.
Yes.
So fascinating. Absolutely cannot wait.
Yeah.
So I just want to start with before we bring the audience questions in, I just wanted to ask a couple things. Robert mentioned, World War I, and it's often remarked that, World War I was the defining generational event for Hemingway's generation. And I guess what I'm curious about is it was an event that made it necessary for Hemingway and some of his peers to invent a new literary style. And I'm curious why you think that was, which is to say, what was it about the impact of World War I, or the way they understood the impact, that made it feel like the only response was a complete revolution in American prose? Robert, do you have a take on that?
We'd love to have the scholar answer that. We're a little out of our depth on that one.
I thought it might be part of your story. That's why I wasn't sure.
It will, yes, but let's have Robert try first.
In my study of American literature, literature changes with great upheavals. So you have the American Civil War, and you have the Romantics writing before the Civil War. You have Whitman writing before the Civil War, and then you have the Civil War. And Romanticism doesn't work anymore. And there's a move to more realistic prose and poetry. Whitman's a great example of this, because you see the way his poetry changes before the war and then after. And the same thing happens with the First World War, where the old values, and Sun Also Rises is a book all about values and the instances of people talking about values. And you've got to get to know the values, and simple exchange of values occurs over and over again. And in Paris in the 1920s, with all of the upheaval, and you have to remember that Europe suffers much more extensively than the United States because of the war. There is this push for the new, make it new, and you reject what had gone before. Hemingway is, one of my professors always said that he was a social realist. But that means that he still adapted these techniques of modernism. The other thing, of course, is you get more interest in psychology and writers trying to adapt what Freud and Jung are doing into their prose to greater or lesser successes. And you have these other competing technologies. You have radio, and you have film, and the amount of interest in sort of adapting prose to what film can do is very important. Hemingway is an avid moviegoer. He didn't want to see films of his work, but he's very happy to see other and hung around with movie stars and in later life. But a lot of what he's trying to do is to adapt what you could do in film in prose. So that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Let me follow. I mean, I'll draw you in with ask a sort of related question. That the Sun Also Rises is, what is the book that kind of defines the lost generation. And partly there's an epigraph by Gertrude Stein, which Hemingway, puts there, which is, you are all a lost generation. I'm curious what you think that means. What is the lost generation? In what ways does The Sun Also Rises embody that? And then going on, I mean, the book was kind of rediscovered in the 1960s, another big generational moment. I wonder what we think about that. And then to say, and does it have something to say to today's generation? I mean, I think that, we have another derailed generation right now. For different reasons, obviously, it's not the same as a war, but nevertheless, there's a feeling of kind of lostness and derailment, and I wonder if you think that what the book might say to our contemporary generation. So, however you want to address any of that, lost generation, Sun Also Rises, rediscovery in the '60s, what it might say now. I'm just curious if you have any responses to that.
Well, for me, it's about disillusionment, and that's kind of, I think, what Robert was talking about, the shattering of, faith in your elders who's supposed to know what they're doing and do the right thing and protect you and, make the world better for the next generation. Of World War I just blew that open. So you have Jake Barnes, who's the walking embodiment of, he's been wounded and he is damaged, and it's an externalization of this whole generation being, I'm sounding like an English teacher, and I'm definitely not, but that's what I take away from it, is just this sense of loss and, emptiness kind of, and lack of purpose and lack of faith. And yet within that, the characters are trying to find something to hold on to. And they're sort of bouncing off each other in different ways, some good, some bad. But it's that search for meaning in a way of, how do we go forward if everything is effed up? And not our fault. We didn't do it, but now we have to pay, we have to find a way. So, and there are these moments of connection, moments of, transcendence even here and there. And then this just sort of lost souls wandering around, unable to make their way forward. So it's complicated and it's not resolved. And maybe that's why in the 60s, when there was such upheaval and, loss of faith in the generation that had got us into the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement was turning America upside down, I didn't know that. So that's really interesting because I first read the book in the 70s, but it makes sense to me that that generation would have resonated with the book, and how sort of, I don't know, profound it is in this generation disconnection. So well, I don't know about today's next generation, but we have screwed up our world so badly that maybe that's what they will be resonating with.
Sarah, did you want to say
No,
something?
I was just going to say, I think for for the people living right now, I think to my mind, it feels in studying American history like we are living through a different kind of world war, and that nothing that we knew a year ago is the same, and our children are going to have to figure out how to manage that at each different age and station in life. So that's a lot like, actually, I think, the end of World War I. Hemingway was there for all of it, right? He was there for World War I and World War II.
And Hemingway later, in A Movable Feast, addressed this and Stein's comment about a lost generation. And actually, it was adapted from a preface that he was going to include with The Sun Also Rises and decided not to. But he said that every generation is lost by something, or loses something. But I want to get to Lynn's comment. There are moments of transcendence, and where those moments of transcendence and Sun Also Rises occur are through art, and through Jake's reaction to bullfighting as an art, and companionship. My favorite moments in there are he and Bill Gorton fishing and dining well in Paris, and it makes me really wish I could go to Paris now every time I read it.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very well said. And I think that, I was going to say that the loss is, all these works are drenched in loss.
Yeah.
And I think that to not see kind of the masculine sport stuff in the context of that is to miss kind of what's going on there. I have just the passage, speaking of moments of transcendence, in Big Two-Hearted River, when Nick finally gets to the campsite. And in this classic moment of, Hemingway style, he says, inside the tent, the light came through the brown canvas. It smelled pleasantly of canvas. Already there was something mysterious and homelike. Nick was happy as he crawled inside the tent. He had not been unhappy all day. This was different, though. Now things were done. There had been this to do. Now it was done. It had been a hard trip. He was very tired. That was done. He had made his camp. He was settled. Nothing could touch him. It was a good place to camp. He was there in the good place. He was in his home where he had made it. Now, it's a moment of game fishing or whatever, but the context of it is, it's this moment of consolation, in a landscape which has been burned to the ground, actually. So, and I think what you say is very true, and I think that the bullfighting and all those other private rituals seem sometimes to be gestures toward a kind of dignity which you can't find in the world anymore. That's been lost somehow. Anyway. But just, I wanted to just ask about that too, in terms of influence of Hemingway. Before we turn to the questions, which we'll do in a moment, there are two public figures in America who were and are Hemingway fans. One was John McCain. Was a Hemingway fan, and For Whom the Bell Tolls was his favorite novel. And during the 2008 campaign, he once read The Snows of Kilimanjaro aloud to his family and aides in a hotel room. And then in 2016, Joe Biden, talking about his son's death, quoted A Farewell to Arms, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places." I'm wondering what you think about that. What is it? And it clearly resonates with this loss that we've been talking about, but also something else, some kind of strength, loss and strength at the same time, I guess, with both these men. What do you think it is that they're connecting to in Hemingway?
Well, we had the incredible privilege of being able to do an interview with John McCain before he passed away. Ken Burns and Sarah and I went to Washington, and Ken interviewed the senator, and he spoke a lot about his reverence for Hemingway. And it was this a sort of idealism. For him, it was the idea that in the case of Robert Jordan and For Whom the Bell Tolls, he was dedicated to something larger than himself, even though he knew it was a lost cause. So there's a sense of self-sacrifice and kind of fatalism. And I think John McCain certainly, especially how he faced his final months and days with such dignity and heroism. I think he was sort of embodying that, and even the experiences he had in the Vietnam War. So for him, it was that as a little kid, he fell in love with Robert Jordan, and he sort of embodied this romantic ideal, but also a complicated person. And McCain could kind of wrap his head around all of that. So that was a really beautiful moment, and you'll see it in the film. It's really, it made me resonate, warm to the book in a way that I really hadn't, just feeling his passion for the character and what he stood for. And I'm going to have Sarah talk about.
Sarah, I know it's one of your,
Yes.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite passages of Hemingway. It feels a little bit cliched, but it is. I think when we first were working on the film, we quoted from that passage, not in its entirety, and ended up actually adding to it, because I think the full quote is extremely, it's one of the most beautiful passages in American literature, I think. And I remember, I hadn't really made the connection, but Joe Biden, John McCain, both of whom are, wrestling with, carrying, and thinking about Hemingway and his work all through their lives for very real reasons that are directly in connection to who they both were as older men. So that's really interesting. And I will say McCain's presence in the film is unexpected and very powerful.
Can't wait to see it. Robert, before we turn to audience questions, did you want to add anything, or?
The McCain is, it's always, I like that Hemingway reaches so many different people, and so many different people get something unique to themselves from that. And with McCain, I obviously did not know either Senator or President-elect Biden, but the interesting thing is Jordan's sense of duty, and how he, although he knows the attack is going to be a failure, he knows he still does his duty. I'm teaching online a Hemingway seminar here, and we've just gotten to Islands in the Stream, and a passage and that from Thomas Hudson, where you've lost your children, you've lost your wives, you lost your work. What do you have left? You have your duty. You have what you have set out to do. And that kind of holds you together.
Well said. Okay.
I think just one other thing we haven't really touched on, but just that the end of Hemingway's life is obviously very sad and very tragic. And as much as he was so wonderful at dropping you into these great moments of life and pain and drama and tragedy, and had such a lust for life, he ends up dying in a very sad and tragic way. And the end of the film is really very dark and sad. And I think we haven't really talked about that. It's a little bit in his work, but it's also really deeply in his life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we have time. Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. I guess here's a question that goes, to the complexity of Hemingway's motives, I would say. Maria Novella Mercuri of Coulsdon, United Kingdom, asks, did Hemingway volunteer to be an ambulance driver during World War I because of a sense of solidarity towards the cause, Europeans, or love of adventure, or because he found himself in Paris?
Oh, he wasn't in Paris. No, he was in Kansas City. He was definitely not in Paris. He had never been to Paris.
He tried to enlist in every branch of the military that he could. His eyesight was too bad. The Army would not take him. And the Red Cross was the only organization that would get him to Europe. to take part. He wanted so desperately to be part of it. I don't think at the time he cared about the Europeans, or it was for the adventure, because he's an 18-year-old kid, and all he knows is that it's going to be an adventure.
Okay, we have a number of questions that go to Hemingway's friendships and the complications of them. And I'll just say, so Robert Reed of Mendon, Massachusetts asks, from what you know of Hemingway, is he someone you would want to be around and might consider a friend? So that's the more personal take on the question. But then there's Larry Morris of Salt Lake City says, Hemingway is well known for breaking with friends such as Dos Passos and Fitzgerald. Which of his friendships do you consider the most enduring? And Forrest Shaw of Fayetteville, North Carolina says, what did Hemingway think of Faulkner and Steinbeck, two other Nobel laureates, personally and their work? And finally, I'm giving you all of these because you can.
Oh my, okay.
Finally, Perry Elders of Westminster, California says, why did Hemingway turn against his mentor, Sherwood Anderson, with the Torrents of Spring? So you can go at this any way you want. I mean, it's, friendships and also rivalries, because all these friendships are with writers. Right. So you can either talk about Anderson's mentorship and Hemingway's ultimate rejection of him, and also, the complicated relationship to Fitzgerald and to Faulkner and Steinbeck. And then your sense of him as a man. Was he, male comradeship and friendship is a central theme in the work. So, was he a good friend? As a person, as a man?
Well, I will take a crack at one part of it, which is just the sense of betrayal that so many of his friends felt at different times, and especially people who had helped him. And that just seems really sort of self-destructive on his part to some degree, but also insecure. I hate to psychoanalyze someone from afar, but there's a sense that someone who helped you, now you want to show that you did it by yourself. You didn't need any help. And the most classic example that, I did not know before we started working on the film was The Sun Also Rises, of Scott Fitzgerald helped him edit the book and get rid of the first several chapters that were really not very good. And then he claimed that it was his idea, so then that's very early in their relationship. Is that not right? Robert is shaking his head.
Fitzgerald suggested reworking, and okay. Hemingway did not really want to rework, so he just cut.
Okay.
Of course, Fitzgerald then famously critiqued Farewell to Arms,
right?
And wrote a long 10-page critique of how it could be improved. And Hemingway famously wrote at the bottom, "Kiss my ass, EH."
Right.
On that, so
he was a master of compression.
Very much so.
Yeah. I think he hurt a lot of people that, he had been close to at different times. Some of them were rival writers. Some of them were friends who he put into his books in thinly veiled portraits, and some were really hurt and insulted. Some loved it. So, it's not a simple thing. But the capacity for real, genuine friendship over time is something he doesn't seem to have really, truly had very often in his life.
So two more questions. One, Stephen Gitcher, this is a question for Sarah and Lynn. Stephen Gitcher says, Sarah, you talked about how little audio we have at Hemingway. Can you talk about the decision to ask Jeff Daniels to voice Hemingway in the film? And there was also another question previously about whether you had discovered any new Hemingway audio in the course of researching the film. So
we didn't discover any new Hemingway audio in the film. There is a clip from World War I that we are pretty sure is Hemingway that I don't think has often been seen, or one of our researchers pulled us over one day and said, I think this is Hemingway. And you'll see it in the film. We slow it down, and hopefully the audiences will lean in and agree with us. So that was our one sort of moving image find. We didn't find any new audio. Jeff Daniels is an extraordinary actor. He's from a similar place in the United States and of, I think, the right age, and was able to play young, medium, and old Hemingway. And he really brought something incredibly special to reading the texts. We recorded him in an unusual way for us. I was actually pre-COVID, but he couldn't come to New York. So we recorded him remotely, which we had never done and now seems totally normal. So that's the sort of behind the scenes thing about Jeff Daniels. It's not a spoiler. We have, great actors also read his Four Wives. So we have Kerry Russell and Meryl Streep and Patricia Clarkson and her name
Mary
is
Louise
Parker are his Four Wives. So we had, reading voices for this film was to hear the text come alive, the letters come alive, how they all spoke to each other. His wives wrote great letters to him, Martha Gellhorn at the top of that list.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm sorry to say, because there's a lot more to talk about. Could you just tell us when the film is premiering?
Yes, it will be on PBS April 5, 6, and 7. It'll be streaming on pbs.org. And tell your friends. We're very excited to have, this is our first real unveiling. We did a small event earlier this summer. So this is our second time sharing the film a little bit, but really thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, for sharing with us. It's exciting. Can't wait. Thank you all. So you've been listening to Lynn Novick, Sarah Botstein, and Robert Trogdon discuss the genius and complex legacy of Ernest Hemingway. His early masterpieces, In Our Time and The Sun Also Rises, and other writings from the 1920s, edited by Robert Trogdon, are published in corrected texts in a new Library of America series volume. And I should say that although Cyber Week is now in the rearview mirror, it makes an excellent present for the holidays that are still a couple of weeks away. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Wednesday, December 16th, it's Peanuts at 70, Writers and Cartoonists on Charlie Brown, Snoopy and the Gang, and the Meaning of Life. A conversation with Sarah Boxer, Jonathan Lethem, Cliff Thompson, and Chris Ware. It's moderated by Andrew Blauner, editor of the Library of America collection, The Peanuts Papers. Details about this and other upcoming Library of America events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Ernest Hemingway edition and the Peanuts anthology, and links to purchase those and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to our three guests for a really fascinating hour, and have a great evening.